So we have been talking about progressive Christian religion for the last 4 Sundays, and we're going to continue talking about that in terms of how progressive means open, scholarly and inclusive, and that we're looking at the Christian aspect, who Jesus is, and that is a deliberate omission of the word Christ. We'll talk about that in a further Sunday. But who Jesus of Nazareth is, in terms of offering us a way of living into justice, which is the way to peace, and the notion that the religious impulse, it comes out of the first impulse of awe and wonder at our existence and this desire to connect to that which is larger than us, and to achieve a kind of wholeness and fullness in our life. So that's kind of the sort of the broad spectrum of what we've been talking about in the last 4 Sundays. And we've looked into these words exoteric and esoteric, sort of the outer exoteric. So remember, just think exit if you're trying to remember which is which is the kind of Christianity that most of us grew up with, which posited a set of beliefs, faith statements, and it was about how to follow those beliefs or faith statements, the rules of the organization, which enabled the organization to maintain some sort of control on what Christianity is. And the notion that progressive Christianity looks more at the esoteric, the inner, the deeper understandings of Christianity. It's not something new, it's something that has existed within Christianity from the beginning. Indeed, what we see Jesus of Nazareth doing in his life is digging deeply into the inner teachings of his Jewish religion. And so digging deep into a way of being that focuses more on the prophetic, which is calling people back to justice and back into relationship with the Creator, and a more mystical understanding of what it means to be in relationship with the Creator. So we've been looking at progressive Christianity from this perspective, and we looked at this little diagram that comes from Brian McLaren, which talks about the Christian story that most of us grew up with. So we started in a state of perfection in the Garden of Eden. We fell into sin, so we have the fall. We are in a state of condemnation. We are in bondage to sin and we cannot free ourselves, and we need salvation. And that salvation is to save us from hell so that we can go to heaven. Diana Butler-Bass calls this elevator Christianity. The entire focus of Christianity is to beam you up, right? It's focused up there and after. Excuse me. Last week we talked a lot about eternal life and a first century Jewish understanding of eternal life as being a deep and whole relationship with Yahweh, not as something that happens afterwards. And so today what we want to do is, one of the things that happens when you get away from the exoteric understanding of Christianity, that Jesus died for our sins, God is this person who needs to be appeased. When you get away from that, one of the first questions is, well, what do you need Jesus for? If Jesus isn't my personal Savior, if believing in Jesus is not the whole focus of Christianity, what is Jesus for? And so what I want to do today is look at the ways in which Jesus matters in progressive Christianity. And progressive Christians look to the teaching of Jesus. And one of the things that we find in the teaching of Jesus is this overarching understanding that God is not an entity that needs to be appeased. Now, Jesus is not going against his Jewish tradition which has focused on the exoteric understanding of Judaism, and the system of sacrifice in the temple becomes really important. The following of the law becomes really, really important. And the inner understanding of this way of being in terms of relationship with Yahweh falls out of the picture in the same ways it's fallen out of the Christian picture in the 21st century. What Jesus is doing is he's calling back his Jewish sisters and brothers to this understanding of eternal life now, being in relationship with God. And we talked last week about the basileia, the realm of God, creating justice, creating heaven here in this life, in this world. And so we look to Jesus because what we see in the teaching of Jesus is a deeper understanding of God as love. Not as an entity that needs to be appeased, placated. There is no need for sacrifice in the teachings of Jesus. And we look to the life of Jesus to see what it means to live a life trusting that one's creator is love. And we look to the death of Jesus to see that even to the extent that Jesus' love could mean his death, he's still willing to put love above anything else. He didn't have to go to Jerusalem. You know, he did not have to go there. But he goes to Jerusalem. He practices nonviolent resistance against the domination system of his day. And so we look to Jesus' death and understand that this idea of embodying love in the world is dangerous. It can get you killed. And then we look to resurrection, not as a physical resuscitation of a corpse, and we'll talk about that more, but rather as an understanding that death cannot conquer love. So even the fear of death can't conquer love. Jesus lives on in all of us. So the need for this belief in a physical resuscitation of a corpse, it's not there. It's not there in Paul. In fact, Paul says it's stupid to ask such a question. You know, what kind of body does Jesus have? That's not the point. You're missing the point. The point is Jesus is living and breathing here and now, continues on. So I'm moving through this rather quickly because I think that most of us have dealt with the system of beliefs for a very long time. For some of us, we conformed to that system of beliefs. We came to church every Sunday and we said the creeds. We may have even put our faith in that system of belief. And suddenly we're presented with new evidence. We talked before about the scientific method and how that changes scientific theory. And yet theology, when we're presented with new evidence, how do we change our theology? Now that we know this wonderful story that we're beginning to know about the creation of the world that we live in, how does that change the way we relate to our Creator? How does that change it? And once we're locked into a system of beliefs, I'm not saying that beliefs aren't important. They are, because what we believe has an impact on how we live. For example, if you believe in the rapture, that we're all going to be taken away, Jesus is coming back and going to take us away, why would you ever recycle? Care for the planet? Because according to that system of beliefs, the planet's going to be destroyed by God anyway. So there's no need to care for the earth. So beliefs are important, but if your faith is not about your belief, your faith is what you trust and how you live your life. And so if we look to the teaching of Jesus and we see this new understanding that God is love, and that what we are called to do is to create the basileia, the realm of God here, now, and that the way to peace is through justice. If we look to those teachings, how does that change the way in which we embody our Christianity? And those are the questions that get asked in terms of progressive Christianity. So we move from a system of beliefs to a way of being. And if we look to the teaching of Jesus, we see that Jesus emphasizes love of neighbor, right? Who's our neighbor?
Everybody.
Everybody. Including, let's just name a few people, right? I think it's important because we tend to go, oh, everybody's my neighbor. And then you say things like Osama bin Laden. And how many of us rejoiced when they shot him? And is that loving? Yes. Tough questions, right? Who is my neighbor? The other piece of this is what is love? It's not, I mean, we have reduced love almost to a cliche. I mean, love can be really, really difficult. Loving our neighbors is not an easy thing, and I have yet to meet, anyone who's accomplished that, myself included. There's a lot of people I don't want to love. There's a lot of people I've fallen out of love with. The other piece is that if we leave behind the Christian exoteric teaching that suggests that we have fallen into sin, we are in bondage to sin and we cannot free ourselves. In Lutheran circles we often talk about that as worm theology. We are wicked. Stories about Luther punishing himself, self-flagellation. I need to be punished. This notion that we are unworthy. And yet, the story we get from scriptures is that God saw that it was good, that we are created in the image of our Creator. How then do we learn to love ourselves? And what does that look like? And in the same way that it's difficult to love our neighbors, it's also difficult to love ourselves, especially those of us who were raised with that particular story. We are not worthy. It's a sense that we have. Neil?
I want to back up a bit, and I don't want you to take too long to answer. And I'm thinking of a couple of my friends, the Jesus Matters bit. Question, why are we looking at a person, a human 2,000 years ago, who was responding to the issues of that time, and who had a lot of flaws, as a guide for our life now? Okay,
I think a couple of reasons for that. Number one, you have to start somewhere. And that's a typical Jack Spong response. This is the tradition in which I was born in. If I was Buddhist, I'd probably start with the Buddha. But this is the tradition I was born in. This is the tradition I know. So in trying to relate to the Creator, I start with Jesus. The other piece of this is, for generations, the stories of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and his teachings have nourished people with a vision of what the divine is. Don Crossan says, if you want to know what God looks like in sandals, you look at Jesus. And so how then do we embody God in the world? That's the example that we're looking at. It doesn't, and this is the part that makes many Christians uncomfortable, because we want Jesus to be the only one. You know, we do this unusual interpretation of, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one gets to the Father but through me. We do a really bad interpretation of that. And we say, unless you believe that Jesus is the only way, you're done, right? And yet, everything that Jesus teaches us about the nature of our Creator would contradict that kind of interpretation. So, we begin with Jesus. Progressive Christianity would not say that Jesus is the only way. And also, Jesus may not be the end. Right? And when we get
it's
to,
as good a place as any to be.
you have to start somewhere.
Okay.
Is that?
Yep, thanks.
So love of self. And in loving our neighbor and in loving ourselves, I think it's only natural that we come to a love of creation. And that, I don't think that Christianity has any business surviving if we're not prepared to teach people how to love creation. I really don't think we deserve to continue if we're not prepared to do that. And I think that, and the reason that God is the last thing on the list is very intentional. You can't learn to love God until you love your neighbor, you love yourself, and you love creation. Not only that, in loving our neighbor, in loving ourselves, and in loving creation, we love God. Because God is present in all of those things.
Then we never get there completely.
No. That's why I started this whole thing by saying I'm not a Christian. I aspire to Christianity. I'm never going to get there. But that's a journey that we're on. And I'm very suspicious of people who feel like they've arrived. They would frighten me. Questions?
If you take, love neighbor, self, creation, take that away, where's God? No, it seems to me that is God.
Yes. Yeah.
In loving your neighbor, Sylvia and I had this conversation after the young man shooting on the dam floor.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe it's my upbringing, but I know the guy was like mentally unstable, but to me, it's like pure evil. That maybe it's the action of the person.
Yeah, I would love to believe that there's evil as an entity. I don't anymore. I used to. I don't anymore. I think that's a reaction that we have as humans because we have a need to understand the incomprehensible. And so we label it as evil. I think the act is maybe evil. The danger in labeling it evil, though, is we then make that young man evil. And then how do we have empathy for that young man? And how do we then love our culture and our society and make his death worth something by contributing to a solution to help young men who are struggling with mental problems. Like unless we can, and that's the hard part of loving neighbor, is you can't just say they're evil and categorize it and then you're done. This was a horrible, horrendous act. What am I called to in this?
We call it evil, but perhaps in true definition, it's the absence of love.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that love and understanding and care, it's easier to do something correct.
Yeah, but if I take the parents' statement at face value, there's an abundance of love there. They tried to get help for their son. They loved their son.
Well, I wasn't suggesting he wasn't exposed to love, but he himself suffered from an absence of love, as in he could not project any feelings towards anyone else.
It may not. I think one of the things. See, we have this need to explain it and understand it, and sometimes it's okay to say that this is totally incomprehensible. There are pieces of it that we can put together, but we can't totally understand it. And I think also we have to move around and see it from different perspectives.
I think one of the tricky things about loving your neighbor who does something like that is that when we label that as evil, we let ourselves off the hook because we don't have to love evil if it's the opposite of love.
Mhm.
But I think that when we recognize, when we love our neighbor, we recognize their humanity. And the scary part about loving your neighbor is you recognize the depth of that human pain in your neighbor that would drive them to do something like take the lives of other people. And so I think one of the dangers of loving your neighbor is you realize you have to love and hold space for your own pain and their horrible pain as well.
I also think the response to, the response to that incident was an act of love from the community. Because the response in each of the ones at the bench, young at the bench, and the one that just happened on the dashboard, was just an outpouring of love from others, not just to the families, but to each other's, as an expression.
And those are beautiful and wonderful, but how do we then move beyond expressions of love and relatively easy actions to demonstrate those expressions into the really tough stuff and saying, you know what? Somebody tell the government to increase my taxes so that we can have better mental health for everyone. I will live with less so that can happen. Like, how can we be that love? If we identify the problem as not enough care in the culture for people who are in the kind of pain that you're talking about, what kind of torment must that young man have been dealing with? And then, how do we deal with the pain of the people who experience the violence? And how do we care for them? I mean, it's obscene that they have to do a GoFundMe page to help pay for the funeral of that little girl. Like, that just should have happened. Somehow and it's great that people have taken care of it, but how do we deal with these kinds of things in our culture? Sharon, you had something.
I was just responding to Ruby's statement. I think it's not only just feeling that pain and knowing that that pain is actually deep in yourself as well, but also a kind of helplessness because, as you said, the response has been love in the simplest form. But even if you say, okay, I could take the more difficult step of increasing, say, increase my taxes to do this, saying that is relatively easy.
Yes.
Impacting other people to change their minds is that much bigger a job, and even that's not enough. Like, so it's almost like there's nothing. Like, it's a real sense of helplessness in how to make this world the heaven that we're looking for. Like,
yeah. And so, how do you cope with that?
How do you cope with that feeling?
And back to Edward's point of, we don't ever really get there, right? We don't. The utopia that we long for, that we seek, is always beyond our grasp. And so we're always. And how do we continue to nourish one another in that grasping for that better place?
I think one of the problems is we seem to advance as a society in terms of justice and whatever, and then some, sorry the expression, but some dick comes along, and we have to push backwards like decades.
Yes.
So how to deal with that? Because all the good people that put their work in over the past century or whatever you want to say, and then all of a sudden it seems almost as if their work was for nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you hold that question and hold us all to account on that question? Because I think we're going to get there to deal with that question, but if it doesn't feel like we have, bring it back, okay? Because I think you're absolutely right and you're onto something. Like, it's really frustrating to have to do things that we thought we had already accomplished. I don't know whether it was last week or the week before, we talked about a first century understanding of salvation, right? So according to the exoteric story, salvation is about being saved for the next life, right? It's being saved from the fiery pits of hell, and we kind of unpacked that and moved on from that. And I want to draw your attention to this understanding of what salvation was in the first century. So liberation from bondage. So the Jewish people had been carried off into bondage several times, and they were in bondage under the Romans at the time of Jesus. And so salvation is always returning to a deeper relationship with the Creator. And salvation is a return from exile. Salvation as deliverance from evil that Lawrence was mentioning. So salvation is a movement from injustice to justice, from violence to peace, from poverty to abundance, from blindness to sight, from salvation. So salvation is both personal. So there's an emphasis in that exoteric understanding of Christianity. There's an emphasis on personal salvation. Jesus is my friend, my personal savior. I am saved. I've got my ticket. Do you? Right? But within Judaism, the emphasis is more on a corporate salvation for the people. And there's an element of personal salvation, but it's in your own way of being in the world in relationship to the divine. And then from death into life. And by death, I mean living death. There were very few Jewish people in the first century, the Pharisees were among them, who believed in life after death. When you were dead, you were gone. Right? That your ability to live on happens in your children. And so this salvation from a living death into the fullness of life, which is the description of eternal life, right? Eternal life is this awakening to a deeper relationship with God, with your neighbors, and with creation. So that's a first century understanding of what salvation is. Can we put some words to what a 21st century understanding of salvation might be? What do we need deliverance from at this point?
Fear.
Fear?
Misunderstanding.
Misunderstanding?
Environmental pollution.
Environmental pollution, oh yeah.
Self-turmoil.
Self-turmoil. Political turmoil, oh my goodness. Here especially.
For me, self-loathing, I would even go to say.
Yeah, deliverance from self-loathing.
That there's a deep part that, for me, it was under everything. There was this fear that somehow I wasn't lovable, that I somehow, if anyone knew the whole story, or including God, if God knew the whole story, it wouldn't be pretty. And then the transition, when I encountered the concept that God loved me unconditionally, and that changed everything. Because all those disquieting, terrifying things that you kept at bay were suddenly disempowered. And so it's the big one, I think, that frees people to be to be able to live in their fullness. That people, once they know that they're loved, then there's a chance. Because then you can risk learning the hard stuff.
Yeah.
Because that undergirds everything.
Someone said one time that they needed to be delivered from the need to be perfect. You know.
I think this is an example of our 21st century versus the first. I may be wrong. I suspect in those days they had very little concern about self-actualization and And as a society, we are, and I've trained in it, self-actualization, we are so preoccupied with self-analysis and whatever, but I guess this is applying our system to where we are now. But it's interesting that even some of the political analysts are saying the self is way overdone, we've got to move back to the corporate.
The corporate, yeah. So deliverance from this sort of preoccupation with self.
Deliverance from materialism.
From materialism, yeah.
That
Mass consumption.
and you have to have.
And in some ways, for me, deliverance from the system of beliefs that I thought I had to believe in order to be Christian. Like, being freed from that is huge. Interesting though, I think there's a lot of, there are many commonalities between the first century and this one. I mean, we're not under siege by a Roman occupation, but we live next door to an empire that has a history of domination. And we have the benefits of privilege from a culture that has dominated. You know, we talk about our indigenous sisters and brothers, and salvation is a whole other thing there. How do we achieve deliverance from our colonialism? So the need for salvation is interesting, and I think that one of the things that we're failing to do as a church in many ways is to address the needs of salvation with a way of being in the world that emphasizes the teachings about the reality, as you said, that God is loving. That there's this, that whatever is behind, whatever is the source of all creation, that is loving. The universe is not against us. Right? It's not punitive, it's not trying to punish us, that whatever is the source of all reality is love. And as followers of this particular way of being, we need to embody that love in the world. And so, you know, we go back on that whole notion that justice is what love looks like in public. It's the Cornel West quote. And so, the reason I wanted you to hold your question, Edward, was because I think that as an individual, I become so worn down by the frustration that I need community to encourage me. And the days when I can't do it, Sherilyn does it for me, or Sylvia does it for me, or Sharon. You know, like, it happens, right? Or I get someone who will come up to me and encourage me to keep at it, right? I think that's, so for me, this whole notion of you know, Jesus and salvation is about, what if Jesus is right? Right? What if Jesus is right and the source of all creation is love, and that the way to get to a just world and society is you know, to achieve peace is through justice, which is love, right? And what if the route through that is to love my neighbor and love myself? If Jesus is right about all those things, then what should our churches look like, right? For me, I think that this is what sets us apart from other communities. We keep hearing that 21st century people are lonely and they're in desperate need of community. Yes, that's true. What kind of community are we offering? I don't think that Christianity can continue unless we learn how to offer community where together, we're working together, learning together how to embody this love in the world. I think that's something that as Christians, following the teachings of Jesus, we have something unique to offer. And you know, what would church look like if it wasn't about a system of beliefs? If it was sitting down and saying, how do I be love in this situation? Like, help me, I can't figure this out. oh, I can't stand I thought we were making progress on climate change, and now we've got all these governments who don't even want to go there. Like, how do we deal with this? You know, so we move from being an organized religion, right, to an organizing religion. Because an organized religion has to protect the organization, because what we've organized ourselves into, we want to maintain. But if we're about the process of organizing, you know, that's a whole different thing. What would our churches look like if we gather together? We begin with the teachings of Jesus, with the life of Jesus, with the death of Jesus, with the resurrection piece. We begin with those things, and then we move out into the world to see how to be loved in the world. So I thought I'd get you to tell me the story of the Good Samaritan. Tell me the story of the Good Samaritan. What happens in the story of the Good Samaritan?
A man is attacked.
What kind of man? A Samaritan. Who is what? What's a Samaritan? No, it's a still in the Middle East.
I didn't think the Samaritan was attacked. Wasn't it the Samaritan that helped?
Yeah, you're right.
That's right.
A man was journeying.
A man was journeying. What kind of man? No? What kind of man?
Maybe it was just Jewish.
A Jewish man.
No, it says.
Doesn't say.
Could be any.
Any man. Could be you. So Andrew's traveling down the road, and he's attacked. And he's lying there,
Left for dead.
left for dead. And along comes a priest. So I come along, and what do?
Go around the far side.
I go around the far side, because I gotta get to church, I got a sermon to preach, I can't
It's
do this.
inconvenient.
It's really inconvenient. Who comes next? A Pharisee. Pharisee. What would a modern day Pharisee be like? Someone who's concerned with the rules.
A warden or an elder.
A warden or an elder comes along and says, well, if Andrew had have been walking on the proper side of the road or at the proper time of day, he
Probably deserved this.
Probably deserved it. Probably did something, you know? And then along comes a Samaritan. Who's a Samaritan?
A foreigner.
Outsider.
Well,
Not necessarily a foreigner, but a Samaritan.
out of the area, yes.
No, not out of the area necessarily. Could be your neighbor.
Not a Jew.
Someone might.
A different kind of Jew.
Oh, okay.
A different kind of, Samaritans are basically Jewish, but they're different kinds of Jews. So along comes this Samaritan, who is basically, in your opinion, the scum of the earth. You're the listener now, right? The scum of the earth. Whoever, just think of the scum of the earth. Who, in your opinion, is the scum of the earth? I missed that one. I can't hear. So the scum of the earth comes along, and what does he do? He helps over and above, right? And the surprise in the story is that the person who helps is not the person you would expect to be helping, right? So, the reason I chose this particular story is because John Crossan says it's one of the teachings of Jesus where nobody worries about whether this actually happened or not, right? Nobody wants to know whether it's historical. There's no miracle involved, except there is a miracle involved, right? But you don't have to believe a certain set of things. You just have to know that it could happen to you. Somebody last night at dinner told a story. John told the story of being stuck in the south in his car. And some people he didn't expect, they pulled over and helped him. So anybody hearing a story like that, it's like, oh, isn't that wonderful? You know, somebody unexpected was love, right? So what if we look to the teachings of Jesus and we say, okay, when was the last time you crossed the road to be loved?
I think with that lot, if we're driving along and our car's stuck, we've got things to do, and it gets a little tricky
Yeah.
to stop. And
We used to in the old days, we'd stop. I used to pick up hitchhikers in the old days. Heck, I used to hitchhike in the old
They
days.
had cell phones now.
Yeah.
An interesting thing, volunteer at the hospital and I have my smock on, I can help anybody and they like it. I take that smock off and I don't dare, when I see a woman that I think I could give a ride or something, there's no way I dare.
Yeah.
The culture has made it difficult to be
Well,
a Samaritan.
That's-
Okay, and so we're talking about, you know, how do we don't necessarily know that the Samaritan didn't know the person who was lying in the road. How do we make that effort? What do we need to make that effort to cross the road to help?
Empathy. Some empathy.
Some empathy,
A lot of courage. A lot of courage.
a lot of courage? And where are we gonna get that courage from?
Organizing. And I think
Organizing.
Lawrence may know this better, but I think if there's a fight at a school or something, I think they say if one person goes in and says help,
Mhm.
the others will come in.
Yeah.
But if that person doesn't, everybody stands and watches.
Let's make it a little bit more immediate. You're on the subway. And there's a woman sitting a couple of seats up and she's wearing a hijab. And someone comes on the subway and starts berating her to go back to her country. How do you be loved in that situation? What's going to make you stand up out of your seat?
And
What
what
kind
if the person berating has a gun and is
Exactly.
waving it? Does that change your action?
Mhm. Yeah,
Or if everyone on the subway has their cell phones out and is filming.
yeah. So what I'm getting at here is when we talk about what should be the concern of the Christian community, it's conversations like this, I think. If we are gathering together to learn how to be love, how to embody love, it requires a certain amount of learning. This is a new world, right? When we were children, our parents taught us not to talk to, well, no, my parents didn't teach me not to talk to strangers. I wasn't supposed to take candy from strangers, that was the thing. But I could talk to them.
Don't go with them.
Don't go anywhere.
Don't go with them.
No, I never
Everybody
got that.
allowed to talk to them.
I was allowed to talk to them, but I don't remember. Maybe I did, I just don't remember. But nowadays, we celebrate. We sit on the front porch a lot, and we celebrate when we see kids playing outside. Because we don't see that much anymore. And yet, statistics tell us the kids are safer. But what I'm getting at here is that if we live in isolation, to your question, the frustrations of life can break us down. And if the purpose of community is to provide sanctuary, so we come in sometimes in a state of brokenness. I don't know about you, but when I'm broken, I don't want to love anybody. I need to be loved and nourished and fed. And then maybe when there's been some healing, I'm ready to go and love someone. So if the purpose of Christian community is not to focus on inculcating a set of beliefs, but rather teaching how to embody a way of being in the world that is love, that's something that I can get excited about. That's the kind of community that I want to be a part of. That's the kind of community that I want to sit down with and go, I mean, there are days, don't get me wrong, there are days when I come in here and someone will start talking about the environment and I'll be like, I just can't go there anymore. I am so tired of worrying about the environment. Or someone will talk about Indigenous sisters and brothers and it's like, I know they don't have any water. It's just too much, I can't bear it anymore. I can't hear one more thing. And yet, in the community, others will carry that for me. I can trust that there will be others that will carry it until I'm ready to pick it up, until I've been nourished by the community to pick it up and to continue. The other thing is that I don't know how to fix it. I've learned more from many of you about the environment than I've ever known. I need the collective wisdom of the community. Like, how do we strategize around, I keep going back to last night, but we were, what are we gonna do? Like, we're gonna have to set up a system to get us all down to Toronto to protest. And, we're gonna be out in the street, like, it's only been a few weeks, but, things are getting kind of scary. We're going to be out in the streets a lot. And how do we strengthen one another to be that witness, that loving witness in the world? If that's the purpose of Christian community, then I'm interested. Count me in. If it's about inculcating a certain amount of beliefs, don't get me wrong, beliefs are important. It's important to believe and to trust that love is the source of reality. It's important to believe and to trust that we are not fallen human beings, but rather incomplete, evolving, growing human beings. And that if we nurture one another, we'll grow into the fullness. Like, we all want to be the best possible people we can be. You know, I want to be a more loving person. 99.9% of the reason that orange fellow down in the south makes me so crazy is he makes me a lesser person, because I wish bad things to happen to him. And that's not who I want to be, right? So within community, if I'm called to be a better person, a more loving person, the strength of that, we all have had friends in our lives who made us less than we are, right? And if we can build communities that make us, you know, I love Phil Gully's uses the wonderful, I think it's a Quaker saying, you know, that calls upon our better angels. I mean, you call upon my better angels all the time. I'm not a very nice person. My first inclination is not generosity or hospitality, but you call me out of this not so nice person that I am and make me a better human being. And that's what I mean about gathering together to learn how to love.
I think one of the, at least for me, key factors, you use the word community. It's kind of ironic, we're so aware of what's going on in the world that we lose that family, that community, that feeling of belonging. When you live in an apartment building, you hardly know anybody. When you live in a single family unit, you tend to know your neighbors. And I think that community is part of what makes us maybe want to step up when someone's being injured, or to love your neighbor, to participate in things. Maybe, you know, as I say, knowing more about what's going on in the world has made us who we are, has made us not worse, but less caring, less
More afraid, your word fear. I think we're more afraid than,
Yes.
because we know more. And so one of the things that I rely on community for, because I can go really, really dark, really, really quickly, is I rely on community because there are people who are optimistic in the world that can call me out. Every once in a while I have to go be with a real extrovert, right, who will tell me how wonderful the world is and how beautiful creation is, so that I can remember. You know, hope, beautiful word. I need that hope, and I think that if that's what we're fostering, I think if we're so focused on inculcating a system of beliefs, think of the regular liturgy that we have. It's all about, this is what you're going to believe, right? How would this change our liturgy? You know, if our songs are about justice, if our prayers are about justice, that changes who we are. And I'm not talking about the cliche kind of love here. This is the really hard kind of love. But it's also the really beautiful, rewarding, amazing, terrifying kind of love, right? So what if our rituals take on this role of everything we do? What would we be teaching our children? You know? And I'm looking around here, most of our children are grown. Grandchildren, what are we teaching our grandchildren about the world and about being loved? And so a couple of grandparents sit down together and they have a conversation about how do we communicate that there are wonderful things going on in the world. You know, how do we talk to our grandchildren about the fact that you don't have to be afraid? is love, you know?
Talking about community, Nadia Boltz-Weber,
Yeah.
I think that's your last name, she has an interesting approach when you talk about the creeds. She speaks very much about community the way we have here, and that you need to have a place to go where everybody can play a part and can, you know, you don't have to do it all, we've got other people who can do it. And even when it comes to the creed, she said, I don't have to believe every line because there's somebody else in the room
Yeah.
who does that. Very interesting. So she's okay with the creeds because she feels that it's back to your community.
Yeah. And that's like, you know, sometimes I say, people say, I hate singing that song because it's all that old theology, we don't believe that anymore, why do we sing that song? And I say, well, it's my Tammy Wynette story. I love Tammy Wynette. And her most famous song is Stand By Your Man. That's not part of my experience, I'm not standing by any man. But when that comes on the radio, I turn it up and sing it loud, because I love the song. It's, you know, but the other thing is that I think one of the things that we've done, you mentioned materialism, and then we went on to consumerism. We've turned church into a consumer culture. When you come here, you're not just coming here for yourself. You're coming here to create community. And we do that at funerals, right? We go to funerals for people that we didn't even know. Why do we go there? To create community. Right? We go for the person that we care about who's lost someone. We come here on a Sunday morning to create a space to hold this love in. And so it's not if you come to church and you don't get anything out of the service, that's okay. If everybody comes and nobody gets anything out of the service, we got a problem. But sometimes you come to sing for other people. And the choir is really good about this, right? Not a performance choir, but an uplifting choir that helps us all to sing, except for me, I don't sing like an angel. But you guys all sing like angels because we have this choir that uplifts us, right? Church is still called a service when we come together on Sunday morning. You come to serve, you don't come to get. Yes?
Just going back to what you and Judy just said, tell me again, and I think I know this, but why do we have the creeds?
Okay. We have the creeds. We're doing okay for time right now, I think. We have the creeds for a particular reason. They are designed to determine who's in and who's out. If you believe this, you're a Christian. If you don't, you're out. Within the Lutheran Church, we are called what's called a confessing church. And confessing is another way of saying professing. We profess this to be true. The creeds themselves were political documents that were created by empire, Constantine, at a time when the church was the dominating force. Notice that's what Jesus was against, domination, but the church became that for a very long time. The creeds were political documents to achieve uniformity of belief, so that you could know who's in your tribe and who's not in your tribe. The problem is that somewhere along the road, they were brought into the liturgy. Not till very late, they were brought into the liturgy. Mostly, particularly after the denominationalism happens, so after the Reformation, it becomes, various churches want to say, this is who we are. We follow the apostolic tradition, the Nicene tradition, and for Lutherans, I'm sorry, but the Athanasian Creed is part of our confession of faith, which has those horrible anti-Semitic lines in it. If your faith is about a system of belief, those creeds are there. And so if someone says, what do you believe? All you have to do is recite the creed. Jesus knew nothing of the theology that's described in those creeds. He knew nothing of virgin birth. He knew nothing of the Trinity. So we're looking, notice how I always say we're looking to the teachings of Jesus. The creeds, we could do a whole hour, which we're not going to do on the creeds, but there you go. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so what What will our church look like if our focus is teaching how to love? Love of neighbors, love of ourselves, love of creation, and love of God. That's the particular kind of community that we're about. It doesn't matter if Pat believes in the virgin birth and someone else believes in the rapture. That's not the focus of this community. The focus of this community is gathering together to learn how to love. And the way that we do it, Neil, from your first question, is we begin with the teachings of Jesus. And we move out from there. And by moving out from there, that means that we go, oh, our neighbors that we love. That's why we studied Islam last year. What can we learn from our neighbors about love? What can we learn from the culture about love? Pete Rollins says, don't sing hymns in church, sing love songs. You know, most love songs are too schmaltzy for me. I don't really want to sing those in church, but Sharon.
It seems like a call to, as you said, to organizing, which it seems to me that the change of bringing love into everything, every behavior, relationship, and so on, and fighting for justice implies being political, and we're not allowed to be political given our situation as a church.
Actually, that's changed. The law's changed just last week, 2 weeks ago. You can be political. And show me a corner of life that isn't political. All of life is political. We can talk about the political piece in depth, but love is justice is what love looks like in public. So that's where the hyper-political piece comes from, creating justice in the world. That's not the whole picture. I need to learn how to love Andrew and Edward. I don't do a very good job of it, right? So if the focus of this community is to learn how to better love one another, I need to learn how to love people I disagree with. You know, I need to learn how to walk into a room full of fundamentalists and not have my brains explode, right? So I'm an imperfect, incomplete lover. And it's not, and I would argue that learning to love Andrew is also political, because that's how we negotiate. I guess the kind of, and organizing a situation where I can learn to love Andrew better, that's important. Organizing a situation where I can have tea with some fundamentalists, that's important. So it's not political organization per se, right? That's not the focus. Does that help?
But it seems small.
It seems small?
It seems like a small.
Depending on how broad your use of the term political.
I think so, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, how broad is your term political? The other thing is yes, it's political. Jesus was political. They did not crucify Jesus because he was religious. They crucified Jesus because he threatened the status quo of the dominating force. Yes?
I think that maybe if we want to do, and this is a joke.
Thank you for the preface.
Learn about loving, you need to come to Alberta with me.
Oh, yes. I need to learn to love the people of
All
Alberta.
my family, right?
Yes. We have this running joke about Alberta because there was a time when it was, well, now my beloved British Columbia needs to learn how to love Alberta because of the... Life is political.
Yes.
And our lives are particularly political because we don't live out in the sticks, and even out in the sticks it's political. But we live in a community, so we have to figure out how to get along. But I think an organizing religion is one that's focused. If my focus is making sure that Andrew understands the Apostles' Creed and what it means, the way that our church teaches it, not the way some other church teaches it, but the way this church teaches it. If that's my organized focus, is on what everyone believes, then all I have to do is teach you what it says. And all you have to do is learn this little pile of beliefs. Right?
And a big PS, that is colonialism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Organized religion stamps a stamp around this is what good people believe, and if you want to be a good person, you got to believe it.
Yeah.
But I love your point about it not feeling big enough, because I've been thinking about this, about coming to this church, and Mark probably remembers the first time I came to this church, because I had done away with organized religion. I had done away with Christianity. As somebody who's committed to social justice, I just thought, nope, not going to find it. And I came into this church as a millennial, which I think I'm probably right? And I burst into uncontrollable, sobbing, ugly tears. And instead of Mark, who happened to be sitting next to me, saying, you know, a lot of the things that you're sharing with me, we don't, in our organized religion, we don't really hold space for them. She just held me. She just held space for all the things. And that was political, not only because it transformed my life to have someone hold space for me that way in this community and to say, your ugliness is welcome here, and your, you know, horrible mess of story that you're sharing with me is welcome here. But it also enabled me, the person, to go and share those things with the people that I serve in my work, with my children, with my parents, with the rest of the world. So it's really, I think, important when we talk about organizing that personal is so political that way. When you care for someone that way, it's so political, and it enables them to do all the things that they have strengths to do in the world and then come back.
The danger with language is that it always lets us down, and organizing is a nice word, and it's kind of cute to go, we're moving from organized religion to organizing. But organizing is also colonial, right? So we have to be very, very careful. Last week I talked about, you know, the Micah piece that says, walk humbly with your God. We have to be able to sit down with folks and be prepared to be changed. Even those things that we most cherish, we have to be able to sit down with people and say, okay, and that makes that interaction dangerous, because who knows what that change will mean. What it will cost us emotionally and whatever. So I'm not going to finish up with all this other stuff. I'm just going to say that if our overriding focus is gathering together to help one another to grow as lovers, right? And to understand that at the very heart of all that is this unimaginable, mysterious, inexpressible love, you know, and that the kind of freedom, the deliverance that is, you know, it's a way of knowing that even in our frustrations, our inability to cope with the largeness of the problem, there's still hope. You know, there's still hope. And together in community, we can, and the other thing is that, you know, we're going to get it wrong. We're going to make mistakes. That's the humility part, right? We're going to make mistakes. And how do we, like, that's also the hard question, the hard part, right? Because we can build a community where, like, we all do the cliche love, and I smile at them and say, oh, I really love you, you're a really nice person, and then I'm like, oh, I can't. It's like, I say to you, you know what? I can't take what you're doing anymore, because it hurts me. And we have to resolve this. Don't worry, Lawrence, I'm looking in your direction. But it's saying, like, it's people coming to me and saying, you know, this isn't working. What's happening here? You know, and those are hard. That's really hard. It's a vulnerability, but you can't do that in a place that you don't trust is loving. We've gone a little over time. Next week we'll continue this, but Next week, the content is going to be around the other issue that people have in terms of progressive Christianity, which is, now that I don't believe in the Father God up in the sky, how and why do I pray? We're going to approach the issue of prayer from a progressive perspective next Sunday. And then, as I said before, we're going to get into some more breaking down some of the stuff we've looked at into smaller pieces and working with those.